Uh, we'd like to start this next panel, please. So please be seated. This panel is one that is on human effects of long-duration spaceflight, and it's focused on countermeasure effects in flight, evidence-based. We're fortunate to have two excellent co-moderators, Dr. Inessa Kozlovskaya and Dr. Chuck Sawin. I'll briefly, everyone I think knows the famous Inessa Kozlovskaya and her long-standing relationship with space medicine and space programs in Russia and in the United States as well. She's head of the Sensory Motor Physiology and Countermeasures Department of the Institute of Biomedical Problems, and she's the honorable researcher of the Russian Space Federation. The co-moderator with her is Dr. Chuck Sawin, who has been the chief NASA scientist, served as chair of the Committee for Protection of Human Subjects and chair of the Human Research Multilateral Review Board at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Dr. Kozlovskaya and Dr. Sawin.
Thank you, Bobby. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting us and giving us chance to participate in such a very interesting discussion. And we, Chuck and myself, we have a little bit different task than the other moderators because all the other moderators were just one of them. Now we are two of us, and we will we will be singing duet. So I will start, and Chuck will now present our participant of the panel, and after that I will tell a few words about the topic which we think with Chuck will be of interest to discuss today. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Inessa, and thank you everybody for allowing me to participate in this very interesting event. I'd like to briefly introduce our panel members. To my immediate right is Dr. Hiroshi Oshima of JAXA. Dr. Oshima is very involved in their biomedical research program. He is a principal investigator for a current study on ISS dealing with bisphosphonate therapy, and he also is the bioethics representative for JAXA. And to his right, Pavel Vinogradov, a cosmonaut. You heard him speak this morning. I don't personally know him that well, but I must say I was very impressed by all his comments, and I'm glad he could join us as a long-duration cosmonaut. And next we have Dr. Michael Gernhardt. Mike is sort of the lead person for our EVA research activities at NASA Johnson Space Center. And when we get a chance to let Mike talk today, he'll tell us about some of the particular, I'll call them countermeasure activities related to pre-breathe, which is an important part of getting ready to do EVA. And also Mike's extremely involved with not only all other EVA activities, but trying to come up with the appropriate design for the new EVA suit, which will enable more successful lunar missions and Mars missions. And then to his right, Dr. Shannon Lucid, an old colleague of mine, and a real pleasure to see her. And as you know, she flew 188 days on Mir and did extremely well. I got the full lowdown on her from Dr. Kozlovskaya about how well she did. And so we'd like Shannon to talk a little bit about her experiences on the Mir program in terms of the countermeasures employed there. And finally, Dr. Laura Barger with Dr. Chuck Seisler from Harvard. And Laura's interest, of course, is in circadian rhythms and their impacts on human performance. So this is our group, and I'd like to turn it back to Inessa to give some of the background.
Mm-hmm. When we discussed with Chuck what could be of interest today to concentrate on, because countermeasure, it is extremely wide field. Because when you talk about countermeasure in space, you talk about the countermeasure of so many factors, influence of many factors, first of all. And you talk about protection of many functions and many activities. And therefore, we decided that we will concentrate on what's going on now and what would we like to have tomorrow, talking about the conventional exercise systems. We definitely would like to discuss a necessity of countermeasure, because it's absolutely obvious before the countermeasure were developed and invented, the flight couldn't be longer than 17 days. And even after 17 days of flight, Sevastyanov and Nikolaev were brought back laying flat and hardly breathing. But with the developing of countermeasure, we were going forward, and we came up to 14 months with safely landing our cosmonaut and astronaut after these flights. And definitely we have a lot of data which show how effective the countermeasure system are, because the state of cosmonaut after flight almost fully depends on what they were doing during flight. And we have done the special studies of all our cosmonauts, rating them on their after-flight state, and trying to correlate to what they used as a countermeasure during flight, and this relation almost direct. But the more than exercise, the better they can. However, when we talk about efficacy of exercise system, so we achieved a lot. We can be happy, as Vadim told us here. A lot of happiness. So we could be happy because we achieved a lot. But the main thing of countermeasure is the protection and support, and the efficacy is measured by the results. What is the goal of countermeasure? To keep the cosmonaut performance and state during flight on high enough, to keep the cosmonaut safely landed, to be capable of safe landing, and to be okay and safe and in good state after flight. And when we analyze honestly and the results, they don't look so good, especially when we talk about the future, when this flight will last longer, first of all, but not just this, because in flight, the performance and state of cosmonaut in flight usually is good. It's okay, but it is okay physically. Their performance is also okay, but nobody actually validate their ability. I mean, their sensory motor ability during flight. All medical system, both medical monitoring system, both on Russian and on American side, don't include any test on sensory motor ability. Like the flight success doesn't depend on their sensory motor ability, which actually just, how to say, when we talk about logically, it should be affected, because the sensory motor system is so control system of movements is so complicated, and because it is so complicated, it is supported by many sensory systems, none of which is working in space but vision. So definitely we have effects, but we don't measure them, and it is completely goes along with what Dr. Bogomolov told today. When we don't measure something, it doesn't exist. So it's much more quiet for us. So we can, if we don't know if anything happens, so we think that nothing happened, and we are okay. Now, they land safely, that's okay. But what about after flight? After flight, they are not okay at all. They have very big difficulties in locomotion, in standing, in taking care about themselves. And very recently, we had landing of 3 of our astronauts in forest, and they were lost, and they were searched for 4 hours. 4 hours later, the people who found them, 2 of them were laying flat completely. One of them was like standing in between of them, and he actually helped them to get off the ship. Is it satisfactory for us? More than that, none of the cosmonauts, that's I will tell for absolutely certain, none of the cosmonauts come back without deterioration of this or that physiological function. So it seems that the countermeasure system, in spite of the fact that we achieved a lot, but we have to achieve much more when it comes to talk about the Mars mission or lunar mission, whatever. There will be no doctors around to help them. The chance that the landing will be not as good as it is necessary, still high. So we have to think about advancing our system, and that will be one of the questions which we would like to discuss. What do we have to do? What should be requirements for the Martian mission versus what we have today? And one more thing is that our system of countermeasure, which we use today, of course it was advanced during years, but essentially it is exactly the same system which was developed in the very hard work of people in 70s. It means it exists for 30 years without much changes. But a lot of scientific data are obtained during these years. And it seems that this scientific data give us chance to go forward with new approaches to countermeasure. And that's which would be of interest to discuss as well. So that was our view, and yes, and our duet will be continued.
What I'd like to do is kind of go down the line to our panel members and invite each of them to sort of make some comments about their experiences and their areas of interest, and I'll try and direct the questions a little bit to the individuals. For Dr. Oshima, perhaps he could comment a little bit on this particular new countermeasure study he's involved with, and a little bit about the research that JAXA is doing that he oversees. Dr. Oshima.
I'm very honored to participate in this panel discussion. So now JAXA and NASA has an agreement to start the bisphosphonate study to prevent bone loss and renal stone formations. Now we are planning to administrate two methods: pre-flight intravenous pamidonate administration, and second one is a weekly arendonate pill ingestions. Now we are just to start to explain to recruit the astronaut to participate. And we are expecting to whether new pharmacological countermeasure will prevent the bone loss.
Thank you. Pavel and Shannon, as our long-duration flyers of the 3 astronauts and cosmonauts with us, perhaps each of you would like to make some comments about how you felt about the countermeasure system and how well it took care of you during your mission.
And what should be done in the future?
Ladies first, Shannon?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I flew on Mir. It was the Russian space vehicle. And basically, the countermeasures that I did were the Russian protocol. They had a certain system that you did different exercises every day, and they had it based on a weekly, I think it was a weekly rotation. And I didn't know any better. No one else knew anything else, so we did just like it was written. And
yeah, she did.
And I think it worked well.
I swear that she did. Not everyone, but she did.
No. Well, I was pleased with the way that it worked and with how I felt when I got back. And I guess the one thing that surprised me the most was before I flew on Mir, I'd had the privilege of flying on the space shuttle, which at the time was the longest mission for the space shuttle, which was a 14-day mission. And at the end of that mission, I remember when we got off the next day, my legs really hurt. It was just like if I went out and I ran up a mountain several times this afternoon, tomorrow morning my legs would hurt because I'd been using my muscles in a way I hadn't used them. And I remembered that. And so I told my flight surgeon, I told Galen, I said, okay, now you be sure you have lots of Motrin at the landing site because when I start walking around, I don't want to hurt. I'm not big into pain. And so I guess that's what surprised me the most was that I didn't have a single solitary pain of using muscles after I got back because the muscles I used for locomotion, etc., had all been used while I was in flight, and so I didn't have any pain from using muscles once I got back to Earth because they had been unused. So that was my biggest surprise.
Well, I believe I met you on campus about 1 week post-landing. You were walking quite normally and comfortably across JSC.
Oh, yeah. I mean...
So that was...
I can add that in this mission, Shannon was supported by 2 young men who appreciated her being on station, and they like to somehow, to patronize her. And they patronized her through the whole mission. And then when they came back, it turned out that she was okay, but they not.
Yeah, well, what you told me is that they wanted to make sure she had enough time on the countermeasure system, so they hardly did any.
That was the excuse.
That is very interesting because from on shuttle flights, 2-week shuttle flights, I've done several of those. My legs, particularly my ankles and my hamstrings, are always very sore for 3 or 4 days.
Right,
So
and it
do you
hurts.
attribute that to all the treadmill work that you did?
I think so. I think because I use those muscles running on the treadmill. And like I said, I was very surprised
Yeah.
because I'm not into pain and I wasn't looking forward to hurting, and I didn't. And I never had to use a single Motrin after I came back.
Thanks, Shannon. Pavel, would you like to make some comments about the countermeasure system?
I will start from what seems a long ways away. Ines Benediktovna mentioned that we had this crew, Nikolai Budarin and Jim Voss, and when they actually missed their sight, they were being looked for a while, and then they were found there, in this kind of state. And I wanted to bring forth an example when athletes, runners, they run for example, for 100 meters and they finish, they cross the finish line and fall down. And maybe that's the kind of state that we're in when you've flown for half a year. You have flown, you have completed your flight, and then you come back and the hatches are open and then they pull you out and all your protective mechanisms just crumble. So now you're safe, you're going to be taken care of. You know that there is no threat for you anymore. And so partially that's what induces this kind of state of being kind of semi-recumbent. It's not because we don't have enough countermeasures. It's because you finished your run, you crossed your finish line, your task is complete. So that's as a manner of introduction, but in actual fact, in the long-duration flight, countermeasure system is extremely important. It plays a vital role, and the countermeasure system that exists today, that we are using now, is sufficiently effective. Personally, I'm concerned about a different thing. It's effective for the flights that we are doing in the low Earth orbit. How effective is it going to be for the more long-duration flights, such as to Mars, is not clear. To extrapolate the data, you would say the longer you flight, the more time you would have to devote to countermeasures, and there will be a point when countermeasures would take most of the crew's useful time. In other words, we will be working on countermeasures in order to just survive, not just in terms of completing mission objectives. So this is the sore point, and I think that resolving this issue probably lies in finding some completely different, more effective countermeasures, methods. Otherwise, we'll never be able to advance. The enormous experience accumulated by Russian colleagues is priceless, and our further steps need to be aimed towards developing new and more effective methods for countermeasures. And I would say that that's probably all I wanted to say. Should I repeat that? Yeah, Chuck didn't hear what you said.
No, I didn't.
Не слышу. Well, I'll just summarize briefly the means and methods that are at our disposal today. They may serve as the foundation for countermeasure system for longer duration flight, and I'm completely certain that looking for new methods is extremely important because, again, I'm repeating myself, we should not allow this situation to occur when we have more time when we have to take more time for countermeasures than for anything else in the flight.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you very much. I agree. Next, if Dr. Laura Barger would like to talk a little bit about the concern or interest and the importance of circadian rhythms on performance.
Sure. We're interested in seeing that the crews perform at high levels throughout the long-duration missions, and to do that, we think they're going to need some really well-planned rest work cycles, because the crew performance is going to depend on them being able to get sufficient amounts of sleep in duration and quality. So we are looking at some of the countermeasures for sleep disruption and circadian disruption. Right now we're studying sleep on the space shuttle and the International Space Station crews. On some preliminary data on the shuttle crews shows that on the nights before EVAs, 50% of the EVA crew members get less than 5 hours of sleep. Like one of the long-duration crew members said this morning, though, we can't extrapolate what sleep is going to look like on the long-duration missions from that. So we're very excited that we just started collecting data on the station crew members. And what is really important is that we're able to collect objective sleep data over the entire mission, because how one sleeps tonight really depends on how you slept last night and the night before, and if you had a change in your work-rest schedule. So we have some really great crew members who are serving as subjects and wearing an ActiWatch device for their entire mission so that we can objectively look at sleep. We're also concerned about circadian rhythm disruption in the lunar sorties and the Martian sorties. We know that from laboratory studies and from the experience of JPL ground support crews that living on the Martian sol day is a great physiological challenge. So some of the countermeasures for that are bright light. We can look at timing of bright light exposure that's sufficiently intense and appropriately timed so that people can adjust their circadian schedule or synchronize to the Martian sol. So the countermeasures for that would be bright light, and we're currently doing research on short wavelength or blue light that the circadian system seems to be more sensitive to. So looking at that as a future countermeasure. Also on the shuttle crews, for sleep disruption, we find that 87% of the crew members in our preliminary data take sleep-promoting medications. So over 50% of the nights on those shuttle sorties, sleep medications are being taken. And we're also seeing now more wake-promoting drugs being taken. So right now it seems to be just an approach of whatever the crew member feels they need, and we would like to look into ways of perhaps optimizing those pharmaceutical countermeasures or standardizing the countermeasure approach.
Thank you very much, Laura. The last individual I'd like to ask to comment to get this panel started would be Dr. Mike Gernhardt. And Mike, for the past roughly 8 years, has been leading a very important area of research at NASA Johnson Space Center to optimize what we call EVA pre-breathe protocols. And I'd like Mike to make a few comments about that important work. I will say, as my former role, chair of the IRB, if you like, that was the highest risk activity we dealt with, and we learned a lot over the years, and it's really going extremely well. Mike's run a really great program, and a lot of benefit to the agency in the new protocols that have been developed and their importance to the agency. Last thing, maybe Mike could make a couple of comments about a rather new activity he's involved with, which is trying to optimize the biomechanical design for a new EVA suit, which will be more suitable for lunar activities. Mike?
Okay, Chuck. Yeah, I'll just make a few comments about the pre-breathe countermeasures and some of the differences between ground trials and what we actually see in spaceflight operations, and some of the misleading inferences that have been made from that data. I'm going to keep this pretty simple, but on the U.S. ground trials, we use a 4-hour oxygen pre-breathe. We have a 4.3 psi suit, and we're saturated at 1 atmosphere. And for the laboratory chamber trials with people in a short-sleep environment, we have 25% DCS. The Russian Orlan suit, for their laboratory trials that Dr. Barrera, Dr. Kutuzov ran, with a 30-minute oxygen pre-breathe and a 5.8 psi suit pressure, they had 30% DCS. Now, there's never been a report of DCS on orbit, and so people come up with all kinds of hypotheses about why there's something magic about microgravity that prevents DCS, and we even have some people that think that it's not necessarily even ethical to do research on DCS because you can't get it in space. And as we've teased out over many years our research program, there are very clear explanations that don't invoke any exotic mechanisms. When you actually go in the U.S. suit and you do a 4-hour pre-breathe, you get at least 30 more minutes effective pre-breathe because we are doing suit configuration checks, purges, leak checks. When we actually depressurize in the airlock, the suit positive pressure release valves keep you 5 psi over the ambient pressure. So all that contributes to about 30 more minutes pre-breathe. Additionally, we have measured the metabolic rates of people, in quotes, resting in a spacesuit, and they are 6.8 milliliters per kilogram minute versus shirt sleeve resting of a test subject which would be like 3.6 to 3.8. We have very clearly and statistically significantly shown that increased metabolic rate enhances the nitrogen elimination. With respect to the Orlan suit, when you look at the actual procedures that you have to go through in the suit, they end up with about 56 minutes of pre-breathe. And some of that is not at pure oxygen, but it's well over 50% oxygen. And they're doing HATS checks and leak checks, and so their metabolic rates are probably every bit as high as they are in our suit. When you look at the Earth-based suited chamber runs that we do, in the U.S. suit, we've had less than 1% DCS. And then in the Russian data, the last I saw that several years ago, they had done 990 suited chamber runs and had no DCS. And so there might be exotic mechanisms in space that are preventing it, but you don't need those to explain the observations that we have. Moving on quickly to the lunar suit, I'll start this up by saying I agree with what Pavel said, that you don't want to get these countermeasures where there's such a significant part of your time that you can't do any work. And one of the things we're doing to drive this program is we've defined what we call the EVA Work Efficiency Index. And that's the EVA time divided by all of the overhead time it takes you to do that EVA and come back in. And right now, for space station operations, our work efficiency index is 0.39. So we're spending almost 3 hours inside getting ready for every hour outside. In my former life, I was a professional deep sea diver doing 1,000-foot saturation dives in a commercial environment. We wouldn't have touched a job without a work efficiency index of 3 or greater. And so we have that now as a requirement for the exploration program. The other thing about the suits, for those of you that have been in them, it takes a lot of operator compensation to work in these suits. It is not an easy thing to do. There was all this talk about the wall of EVA as we got ready to build the space station. That is an anthill compared to what we're looking about for exploration, where we're going to be doing 5 EVAs a week. And with the systems we have right now, we are not able to do that with that kind of frequency. So we really have a lot of work to do. And we're doing studies that are showing that the assumptions we're making with respect to center of gravity of the suit aren't valid, and that we need to get closer to a perfect center of gravity. And probably in the way of countermeasures, the biggest challenge we have is to prevent trauma induced by the suit. And when you're in the suit, we lose our fingernails, we have shoulder injuries, we have abrasions, paresthesias. And the reason we have that trauma is because you move within the suit. So you're constantly rubbing up, you have pressure points. We're actually trying to get a single suit architecture to work, where we launch in a suit that we actually take to the lunar surface. That suit will have hard bearings in it. When we land with up to 20 G transient loads and so forth, if we're moving around in the suit, I don't care if you've got the best NASCAR restraint system, you're going to be injured. And so we're actually developing this undergarment that's an airbag kind of system that would spread the loads out evenly throughout the suit and prevent movement. And we picture that would be run at a fairly low pressure while you're on EVA, but on the landing time frame, you would inflate that to maybe like 2 psi, where it would just keep you completely immobile within the suit. And so that's probably our number one challenge as we look forward to the exploration program.
Thank you, Mike. That's great. Okay, now you've got a kind of a cross section of our areas of expertise and interest. There's something very important that we haven't talked about, and it comes under the heading of potential new countermeasures, and that's artificial gravity. And I'd like Inessa to make some comments about that as part of her participation in a joint program that we have had with DLR and NASA and IMBP.
to tell you the truth, that I think that about artificial gravity and the results of study which were provided right now, that maybe, I don't know if Larry is here. Oh, yeah. So he can tell, and I will ask you a little bit later. But what I wanted to say, there are two points. One point is that during developing of our knowledges about what's going on in space, the emphasis for countermeasure, the priority of different countermeasure was changed. At the beginning, there was a main problem to know if the subject can survive long enough in space. And of course, the attention was on the cardiovascular. And cardiovascular means and methods were developed. And the monitoring system for measuring, for assessment of cardiovascular system was developed. Very, very nice system, and we have it today, and it keeps advancing and keeps developing. Now, when the long-duration flights started, the emphasis went to the skeleton, muscle and bone skeleton. And I wouldn't say that quite comparable to cardiovascular monitoring system, but some system of test was developed, and of course a lot of pre and post flight studies were provided and so on. And what I would say, it is just my opinion, but actually I don't believe that in long duration flight bone and muscle are the limiting system, because we know how to protect them. Now we know it because we see that people like Karzun, who fulfilled the whole system just the same as Shannon, from A to I don't know, to X, there was no changes in muscle or bones, just almost nothing. But what is definitely we see with increasing duration of flight, it is sensory motor. That will be the limit, finally. People would not be able to work and after after being in space. And especially it is critical for interplanetary flight. And we are, like, that's for sure. Whoever has motion sickness during first days in flight has the very same motion sickness the first days after flight, and very severe ones. We don't protect it. We don't have countermeasure for it. And the people cannot coordinate very well themselves. We don't protect it. We don't know how to coordinate, how to help them. We have to think about this. And there are different ways of, and of course, the duration, which Pavel was talking about, duration, it is critical because people, our cosmonaut and astronaut, they used to care about time over there. They even say so. That's funny, but they say, when we say, we ask them, why didn't you exercise 2 times a day, but once? What is not good? He said, because I'm sorry about timing. Time there is extremely expensive. If I will come not very well, you will help me, you will rehab me. That's it. But time-consuming system of countermeasure we have today. And I'm quite sure that we have chance to make this time shorter. And in this respect, I see, this is my own estimation, it could be wrong, absolutely. But I think in this respect, artificial gravity could be very helpful. Because It will give chance. I would not present here the scientific data which makes me think in this way, but everything what is necessary to protect muscle and bone is in AG training. That's for sure. It is reaction forces. It is the loading, axial loading, and so on and so on. Everything is there. So we will be capable of diminishing time, decline time of countermeasure, active countermeasure, if we will use it. But there are other. I wanted Dr. Shima to talk about some new approaches which are now developing Japanese scientists. Very, very interesting, absolutely new approach. I will ask him to tell you. Now, we were doing basic science, trying to analyze what is the main factor which produce all this negative effect of weightlessness. We found that it is diminishing or absence of reaction forces at all in space. And we tested it, and we found that if we will use artificial support, most of the effects in muscle system are diminished also. Now, we talked with Chuck, and I told him that I don't understand why up to now we don't try to load the environment. The environment on station is push-button environment, no load. On the ground, we teach our children to work against gravity, to keep their hand when they're eating, and to keep spoon, and to keep fork, and so on and so on. But not in space. In space, they don't use their forces whatsoever. But we can load our environment, and we can save time for countermeasure. That's what would be of interest. If Hiroshi will tell their approach, completely new one and completely not known. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It is difficult for me to without a figure, but I try.
Without figure. That was the idea of our organizers.
I just introduce a Japanese new innovative techniques. Two methods. One method is electrical stimulation. We call hybrid muscle electrical stimulation, which means electrical stimulation of counter muscle agonist. So when we try to elbow flexion, muscle exercise with electrical muscle exercise applied for triceps muscle. So it will move a resistance exercise without dumbbell in space, and it will make a compression force to the bone. So this is one of the innovative Japanese technique. Another thing is a cards training exercise, which is just a bandage of the proximal part of the upper extremity or lower extremity. For example, the bandage we apply, for example, 110 millimeter Hg for upper extremity to make blood congestion. Venous congestion is stopped, but artery pulsation is occurred during this venous pooling. Astronauts try 10 minutes exercise, which will produce growth hormone induce, and short time exercise can provide a muscle mass increase and muscle strength increase. This is our new innovative proposal.
But it is not only proposal. Behind this proposal, there is a big series of experiments, which the results of which show the validity of this very interesting type of training. Actually, it is training with the decline in oxygenation of muscle. That's what's going on.
Thank you both very much. I'd just like to add one comment. Dr. Alford had requested that we talk about evidence base, and all of the crews are, of course, tested pre, in, and post-flight for the actual changes in many of the body functions. And we were talking about bone, and Nessa mentioned a case of one cosmonaut who apparently... More than one?
Believe me.
Okay.
Not one.
More than one,
Yes.
who showed minimal changes in bone. But if you look on the average at all of those who've flown long-duration missions, on the average, they all lose approximately 8% over a period of 6 months in key areas of the hip. And so it takes up to 3 years to recover that bone mass. And even though they've recovered the bone mass, we're not sure that the structural characteristics of the new bone are the same or as good as the original bone. So there's some subtleties there that some people like Dr. Lang, who did a good bit of this original work, is beginning to look at, and some others using some different diagnostic techniques beyond those that we've used as a standard technique. So
finite element analysis.
That too. That wasn't all, Ken, though. That it's QCT they're using instead of DEXA.
But I think their best data is coming through finite element analysis.
Yeah, and what it says that you're probably getting a lot of new cortical bone laid down, but you're not getting the same structural bone back.
One thing we should take in mind, that variability of the results after flight is huge, from 0 loss to 22%, and until the very last time when we got together to analyze the results of particular flight, we had a discussion with our friend on the American side, because they were showing us statistics and we are showing individual data. Now I know if Clarence is here, he can support what I say, because they started to do the same, to do individual analysis after flight and analyze why this person lost nothing or this lost a lot. And they come to the same conclusion that the results are very much dependable on what they were doing during flight.
Okay, now we'd like to open it up to the audience for some questions of the panel, please. Yes. Do we have a microphone?
Microphone. Where are girls?
I don't know.
Where are
Nice young girls, yeah.
No, that's not proper.
Christian, Nicole, Dr. Buckley up there, please, couple rows up.
Hi, I just had a question about sleep deprivation, and I just wondered if you've noticed an increasing trend in sleep deprivation over time on ISS or MIR with your long-duration flyers. And the reason I ask that is we recently looked at 10 years of data at South Pole over the last decade, and we found an increasing trend in sleep deprivation over time. And in fact, hypnotics are our most common medication that we prescribe. And in 2005, in midwinter, we had 14% of the population on a hypnotic for sleep. And although we feel that circadian rhythm disruption is plays a large part, we also think that the increasing mission stress, psychological stress, is playing a role too. So I wonder if you're seeing a trend in sleep deprivation over time with your long-duration flyers.
We just collected our the first data on the International Space Station, and so we can't share that yet until we have enough that it's non-attributable. So we haven't seen any trends yet. But one thing we'd like to try to figure out, too, is what's causing the sleep deprivation. On our shuttle flights, 1 in 5 crew members reports that noise disturbs their sleep. And so if it's something like noise, we could probably look at some other countermeasures as opposed to hypnotics. to solve that.
That's true.
Dr. Buckley.
Okay, I have two questions, so I will just ask each one in a row. Ask the panel to address them as you wish. My first question is, we've heard that it might, with increasing time in space, that you might have to have more and more countermeasures because you'll have more and more, say, bone loss or muscle atrophy. But I'm wondering, based on the studies on ISS, are we seeing a linear response, or does it actually taper off? That's question one.
Your question is proper. I think that Pavel is mistaken here, because like we had Valery Polyakov, who was flying twice, once 8 months and the other time 14 months, but he used exactly the same time for countermeasure. And what is interesting that he came from the second flight better than from the first, because the system of physical training was a little bit different.
Second question.
My second question is, if you start using artificial gravity to counteract some of these problems, you spoke about some of the tricky problems with motion sickness. If you start using artificial gravity, are you going to introduce that every time you get off an artificial gravity machine, you're going to have to take days to get your...
You are absolutely right, because the I will give Larry right now. I just what I answer. I said that we use the system. It is not one physical training or one stimulation or one cardiovascular. And I'm quite sure that artificial gravity also will be a part of the system, where every mean and method will have their own place and role. Okay, Larry, please.
Thank you. Inessa, and Chuck, with your permission, I'll give you just a quick summary.
Yes,
of course.
Yeah.
2 minutes.
No. Go ahead.
Hey, we're supposed to be a duet.
There remain 3 important open questions about artificial gravity.
Yeah.
Can you afford it? That meant it had to be small enough to fit inside a spacecraft. Will it make people motion sick? We were able to demonstrate that you could adapt everyone to head movements, even at high speeds, up to 30 revolutions per minute. Finally, will it be effective? Will it make any difference? Bill Pulaski at the Johnson Space Center and I led an international study, a pilot study that was just completed in January. We only ran 15 subjects, eight experiments, and 7 controls, bed rested for 21 days. All of the bed rest subjects were 6 degrees head down. The experiment group was put on a centrifuge for 1 hour a day, spinning, as our Japanese colleagues told us, with 1G at heart level. And the good news is everything that we wanted to be protective was protective. Cardiovascular, reduced post-flight orthostasis, muscle loss, but Ken Baldwin ran, much reduced muscle loss on the centrifuge subjects. The bone markers are equivocal. We're right on the edge of statistical significance. 21 days was probably too short to be able to run this. And none of the bad things happened. No vestibular negative after effects, no effects of significance on cognitive processes, so that it was extremely promising, Inessa. And, it seems to fulfill the hopes that a lot of us had for short radius centrifugation.
No, that's, I like myself, I don't doubt. I think that actually this is the first try. The first trial, because the bed rest duration was not appropriate. 3 weeks, too small time for developing all the effects, and therefore the positive effects are not so well, seen. But it is just the start, and we have whenever mean we will suggest now. We have to test it, to provide studies. To get this evidence, as you say, and then to make the optimal system. We have time for Martian mission. We still have time to do it, but we have to do it.
I think we're going to have to conclude, Ken. I'm sorry. We're running a little late, and I want to thank all the panel members.
No, give Ken. We started 10 minutes later.
Our duet isn't working.
Actually, in fairness to the last panel for today, which is going to be a sprint, I think, on their part, because we're trying to get two separate activities into a time that actually is only slightly more than this one. And I know that they've been working hard at this challenge that they have. It's the panel that deals with risk management approach, risk mitigation, standards to deliverables, and there are two parts to this section. One is the panel on standards, which is headed by Kathy Larini. Kathy Larini is the Deputy Director of Space Life Sciences at NASA. She has been previously the manager of NASA's office in the Netherlands and was responsible for the integration of the automated transfer vehicle for the International Space Station. Her co-conspirator, if one wants to look at it like that, as the second panel leader and co-moderator with her in that sense, is Jeannie Becker, who is the Associate Director of the NSBRI and the Chief Scientist. She is the manager at the management level in the NSBRI offices for the special education programs that we have there. So without further ado, Kathy, if you would bring your panel forward.
Thank you, Bobby. Our subpanel will discuss the role of standards in human health and performance risk mitigation and explore some of the challenges associated with implementing this approach. We will also try to clean up some loose ends that were brought up in the discussion today and need to be closed. And we will try to keep you awake, given that we're late in the day and we are what stands between you and dinner. So hopefully, actually that challenge falls to Jeannie and her team. But anyway, this is going to be a challenge since we have only 35 minutes for this subpanel. So we'll try to keep our remarks brief, and that's my little subtle reminder to the rest of the panel. I will briefly introduce the panel, just so you know who we are. Sitting next to me is Don McErlin. He's a former chief engineer for Naval Aviation and currently appointed member of the NASA Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel. I should note that as an engineer here today, he commented to me that he felt like a pregnant bowler at a track meet. And as an engineer myself, I agree. And say that, and I do want to say that your thinly veiled and rather self-serving effort to ensure that the only crew members are medical doctors did not go unnoticed by us engineers. Seated next to him is Dr. Francis Cucinato. He's the chief scientist for NASA's Space Radiation Project. Sitting next to him is Dr. Victor Schneider, who is a senior medical advisor in NASA's Office of the Chief Health and Medical Officer. Seated next to Victor, I believe, is Dr. Mel Antuniano, and he is the director of the FAA Civil Aerospace Medicine Institute. Seated next to him is Dr. Jean-Marc Comtois, the director of operational medicine at the Canadian Space Agency's astronaut office. And at the end of the table is Dr. Jeff Davis, who I think needs no introduction. So the way we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask a question to each of the panelists, and they're kind of spanning the gamut of issues associated with standards. So we'll try to give them each a couple of minutes to comment on the particular challenge that's embedded in the question, and then hopefully this will allow you to stimulate your questions, and then we'll hopefully leave time for questions at the end. So my first question is for Dr. Schneider. As the responsible official at NASA for setting human health and performance standards, standards for healthcare or performance are usually based on substantial clinical experience underwritten by with an extensive database. How is it that NASA has set standards for health and performance with such a small data set?
The NASA standards are hopefully based on risk analysis, and we'll hear more about that. But from my perspective, the risk is the medical adverse occurrences, and then the effects of micro or partial gravity. That's either adaptations or maladaptations. And then they're looked in terms of whether they're mission impact versus career or astronaut impact. And so that when we look at our standards, they're divided into selection and retention and then spaceflight standards. And the selection and retention is really based on Earth populations, basically the military. So that even though that we're looking at small groups of people that are specifically flying for NASA, that the database is related to that of large groups of people. In terms of the spaceflight standards, that's a little bit more difficult, and we have to look for those analog or those surrogate populations that best amplify what we would like for standards. And in this case, we look for those individuals that are healthy but deconditioned and how their performance is related to that, or those people that get sick and how we treat those people in terms of those potential standards that need to be established.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. McErlin. Spaceflight has always looked to the aviation community for our medical models and our explorers. It seems to me that a better analog for long-term missions in isolation in a hazardous environment is the submarine community. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it is interesting that both the United States Navy and the Russian Navy have crews today that spend months out of contact with family and friends. They have little communications, no outside view, if you will. They live in extremely close quarters on artificial atmosphere. By the way, in concert to what was said earlier, at least on U.S. submarines, they don't generally have private sleeping quarters. They do what's called a hot bunk, which means they share a bunk. There is no doctor or physician on board. It is handled by a medically trained technician, and yet they develop into a very highly cohesive team conducting an extremely dangerous mission in a very, very hostile atmosphere under high tension. They utilize selection and highly trained crews, and there's a great deal of cultural indoctrination, some of it which stems from years of tradition, which I'm sure is true in both navies, about how one respects his fellow shipmates' privacy and that sort of thing. It's absolutely verboten, for example, that one would go anywhere near another shipmate's. They each have a little tiny locker, and going anywhere near another shipmate's locker would be considered an absolute breach of courtesy, even to include officers, etc., going into seamen's lockers. That's how they have their private world. That's their space. And I think that would be an interesting database to utilize for some of these studies. The Navy, U.S. Navy, uses a system in terms of certification, for example, for equipment which goes on a submarine, which is called SubSafe, and it provides a very detailed engineering and testing process to ensure the safety and redundancy and reliability of equipment which goes into that particular vehicle. And I think those models are worthwhile for us to study as we think about highly reliable, long-term exposure to hostile environments. It's interesting that we all have used the aviation community, which is where I spent most of my career, because we talk about space flight. But the reality is one doesn't fly in space. one basically propels oneself to the forces of gravity. And so the aviation skills and the selection that we utilize to select aviators may be precisely the wrong set of criteria for selecting long-term astronauts, and what both ourselves and the Russian Navy use to select submariners may in fact be more suited to that job. Thank you.
Dr. Davis, Bill Gerstenmaier earlier told us about Jamestown, and I was there earlier in this week, and the parallels between the explorers of 1607 and the ones of 2007 or 2027 are indeed quite powerful. What I learned was that 104 crew members set out on the journey. 104 crew members, arrived at Jamestown in May, and by the following January there were 38 left alive, and in fact only 2 of them were killed by Indians, as I understand. So the ones that were left, the ones that survived, were the ones that were resourceful and reacted well to adversity. Probably some degree of luck in there as well. But I can't help but think that our current approach to standards will not serve us very well going forward, in that we set standards to make sure that events won't happen in space. They're very tight, very strict standards, but we will have more overriding needs to certify a larger population of people in the future in order to find that medically fit plus resourceful person that can, the kind of person that thrives in a challenging and hostile environment. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, thanks. That's a good question. I think my answer to that would be that it had evolved throughout the day today, in that we talked quite a bit about genetic screening, biomarkers, and the idea there is you would be able to identify a positive or negative characteristic of that person that would make them more adaptive to spaceflight. The downside to that is that's a pretty high stakes, high decision about an individual, and the point that came out in other panels were that you could potentially lose the skill sets of a number of individuals who would be very important to the flight. So that what skills we can take, what crew members are needed for the particular flight, intersecting against trying to ensure health and productivity. So I think the real challenge is going to be with what confidence do we have about a particular biomarker, genetic screening, or other predictive test, in that it should either pretty well let us know that we can predict health or performance for that particular individual with a high degree of certainty, so that if we do make a high stakes decision based on that, we feel it's accurate. So I think my answer is there will be both. I don't think we will have one or the other. I think we probably will employ some, I'll go out on a limb, some genetic screening, some number of biomarkers that we do feel have good predictive ability, balancing that against not overly screening out the population. And we spoke of evidence base just a few minutes ago. That needs to be entirely based on a very, very solid evidence base so that we make good decisions.
Thank you. My next question is for Dr. Antugnano, and it's somewhat related. The medical challenges of setting standards and managing human health risk in the emerging commercial space industry are quite different from NASA's objective of precluding medical events in space. So my question for you is, what are your thoughts on common challenges or differences that can add insight into our solving our problems?
I will ask you to go back in time. Think about the beginning of suborbital flights. Think about X-15 flights, and that represents really the current status of the emerging manned commercial space transportation industry. But think about another difference, that those were space agency-related flights, and now we're dealing with a private operation. We're dealing with a for-profit operation versus national interest versus national pride versus scientific knowledge. So there are different implications here. One thing that we tried at the beginning when the FAA became responsible for licensing of commercial space flights, we looked at NASA, saw all the different categories of standards. Those were not going to work for us. Why? Because in general terms, those are career longevity standards. You are selecting somebody that you are going to invest a lot of money a long time to train them, and they will be useful for a given number of years. Well, now you're talking about space tourists who may pay a lot of money to go maybe once, maybe a couple of times, but they don't care about career longevity. So we have to have the flexibility there that people who may have medical conditions, that for a professional astronaut that's not acceptable, for a space tourist who is going to go once or a couple of times, suborbital flight at least initially, well, we'll have to probably allow under certain conditions for them to go. At the same time, you have the issue of liability. And in a space agency operation, who is liable? The government. But once you are in the commercial sector, who is liable for these space tourism flights? The private company. So what will be the acceptable level of liability? As a result of that, the US Congress, it was in 2004, indicated that we were going to allow commercial space flights with tourists, and we are going to allow the passengers to assume responsibility for their own risks. And they had to sign a release of responsibility. However, the operators had the responsibility to disclose all of the potential risks, to have a full disclosure. Well, that in theory sounds great, but how far do you go in the full disclosure? Are you going to cover the entire spectrum of risks? Or are you going to concentrate on those risks that are the most likely to result in a disaster? So what's full disclosure? We don't know for sure. We have issues about age. We have people who want to take newborns, who want to take infants, who want to take toddlers, just because they have the means to pay for it. And where do you set, for example, limits? We had already a couple of women who said they want to be the first pregnant women in going in suborbital flights. So what do you tell these people? Should we allow, for example, for a short suborbital flight, somebody who is an alcoholic, who has a lot of money, who is a multi-billionaire, that says, well, it's going to be a 2 or 3 hour flight. I may not have a problem if I go up and come down. Well, maybe, maybe not. So the challenges that we're facing are significant, because we have been talking here about long-term missions, a lot of technology that is mature technology. We are facing experimental vehicles, immature technology, new ways of thinking about going to space, and very high expectations of billionaires that say, well, I have the money. What will be the pressure exerted on these companies to say, okay, give me another $10 million and I'll take you up there? So certainly the challenges that we are facing are significant. On the other hand, Richard Jennings can tell you, because of his experience doing the physicals for some of the space adventure flights, these will be useful, because eventually the experience that we get with people in the space tourism sector that they have some medical problems, we are going to learn more about what happens to people that have pathologies that until now, because of the approach that we have taken in space operations through the government, we select those who are very healthy. Well, now we're going to have the experience with people who are not that healthy, who may have to use certain medications, who may not be in that ideal condition. So eventually, if we have a large enough database, that may have some implications for government-operated space flights. So that was my time.
Thank you. This next one is for Dr. Cucinato. Peggy Whitson said earlier in the day that OSHA radiation standards are inappropriate for our application, and we should look differently at setting a spaceflight standard. How do you respond to this?
Okay, so NASA used to allow their limits to be reviewed by OSHA. So there was a Code of Federal Regulations that OSHA maintains that says that an agency can set its own supplementary standards. So it wasn't OSHA telling us what the standard should be. It was NASA telling OSHA what they wanted their standard to be, and then OSHA approving it. More recently, Dr. Williams recontacted OSHA, and they came to a different conclusion, that OSHA has no purview over space limits. So at this point, NASA is not falling under OSHA standards for their new permissible exposure limits for space flight. So the limits for space radiation, my area of expertise, are two types. One is an acute limit, and there you set limits to avoid any circumstances of acute radiation sickness or death. And how you interpret that is really based on costs. That you're not really excluding any possibility. You're assuring that the probability that will occur is below a very small number, and that to be consistent with other acute risk of spaceflight, that's kept at 1% probability. So you're assuring that you're below 1% probability of an acute risk, and that's largely at cost. But you also have a late or risk, and that's predominantly at this point cancer risk, and NASA uses a 3% mortality risk. So we're in setting a 3% mortality risk, you're understanding that morbidity or cancer incidence scales above that a little bit less than a factor of 2, but you're using mortality as a criterion, so it gives you some loose connection to other risk. So there's no perfect connection. So for example, the mission failure risk involves immediate life loss for typically the whole crew. So typically they try to get below a 1% risk. So a 3% risk is 3 times higher, but from understanding of radiation on the ground, we would expect a 40-year-old person to have a 15-year life loss. So there's that difference there right away, even though mortality is the same endpoint. For high LAT radiation, heavy ions and neutrons in space, we expect a larger life loss. It's not known precisely. It's about probably about 25% higher life loss for the average space radiation, approaching 20 years life loss. But overall, these why 3% is really based on ethical, moral, and economic concerns. For example, would be where you can make a perfect correlation, and the risk is chemical limits at NASA are 30 times more stringent. And basically, because from an economical point of view, they can do that. And on the ground, they're actually 300 times more stringent. So these are limits to prevent cancer, and they're set at a much tighter limit. But they can do that with chemical toxicants. It's much easier to control them, and there's not a high cost to that. But the 3% is a good one because it actually allows you to have goals for the program. So what we're really talking about is what is going to drive programs to reach that limit. If you take that away, the incentive to come up with solutions is going to be taken away at the same time. And when you design a vehicle or all these other factors, what kind of mission do you take, when do you go, what altitude, having those standards in place drives you to good solutions. And I think you might look at risk justification for different missions and go to a higher risk in the long run. But for right now, the 3% number is a good one to drive people to try to get to that goal.
Thank you. And my last question is for Dr. Comtois. And before I ask it, I will relate a little story. Back at the time of the architecture studies that came after the vision for space exploration was announced, there was a lot of work within the agency to try to right-size the research budgets, if you will. And I see a lot of astronauts in the room, and many of them are my friends, and I don't want to associate any of these comments with individuals. But it has been said by astronauts that, who needs a human research program? We can take all that money. If I go to Mars and I come back and I die of cancer 2 weeks later, well, too bad. I went there and we succeeded in the mission. Well, in response to this kind of a thought process, NASA's intention. So, Dr. Comtois, I'm getting to your question. NASA's intention with the spaceflight human system standards is to use them to set acceptable levels of risk that the agency can embrace. What are the challenges associated with this approach from your standpoint?
I think that there's 4 elements that need to be considered when one is looking at risk. You cannot look at risk just looking at risk by itself. I think first you need to consider policies, under which you will operate, medical policies, and perhaps under this will derive a definition of what mission success is about. And then based on these policies, you establish what is the acceptable level of risk. Now, who is in the best position to decide what is acceptable risk? I think we heard in the panels this morning that, I would go to Mars and come back, and if I died of radiation, I don't care. Now, crew members, I suspect they will have a much higher tolerance to risk. However, is that where the decision on risk should be? I suspect not necessarily. I think the crew will have to be involved in the decision, but I suspect that a political leader who needs to be reelected may find that this is unacceptable risk. So the tolerance of a political leader or the manager who's responsible for the health of safety of the astronaut may have a much lower tolerance to risk, or family members for that matter. So this discussion of what is acceptable risk is not an easy one. And now you come up with with that decision. Then once you've established what acceptable risk is about, then you need to look at what are you going to be faced in space, what are the conditions you expect to be faced with, and then you must consider the engineering constraints, the design constraints, and so on. And only then can you look at medical standards to mitigate the engineering constraint and fall in within the medical risk that has become acceptable. And this is like a pyramid, and each of these elements form a corner of the pyramid, and any change of each of these elements will affect what can be done and what should be done in the other three elements.
Thank you. Okay, so what we try to do is give you a little view of the complexity of the issues associated with setting standards and implementing them to manage risks on exploration missions, and give you an idea of where the expertise of the panelists may lie. And so at this point, I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. Chuck.
I'll speak loud. This is a question for Frank. How do you know what the risk is if it's 3%, say, for late risk of mortality? Is there a question of how do you estimate the uncertainty in your knowledge of that number? Does the uncertainty?
Okay, so it's both. NASA has a unique system where we look at the uncertainty and we use that to make decisions. But the evidence is there's a large body of epidemiology data for atomic bomb survivors, medical patients, and you can look at those where you can look at leukemia, and not just in atomic bomb survivors, but 6 or 7 major studies, and show that they're consistent within a factor of 2 or so. You can look at breast cancer in patients, the atomic bomb survivors, some of the studies in Russia, and say that there's this fair consistency. In fact, the newer models are not relying entirely on atomic bomb data. It's relying also on patient data for certain sites, including breast and thyroid. So they're using more meta-analysis where you're basing your risk estimates across different populations. But that's for gamma rays and X-rays predominantly. So for space, you have to look at, first, is the mechanism leading to cancer for heavy ions or high LET radiation the same as these types of radiation on the ground? And then you can start looking at the uncertainties in those estimates, and they would be the quality of the radiation, what type of initial biological damage they occur, the dose rate effect uncertainty, the uncertainty in the epidemiology data, and you can use that to make a composite uncertainty analysis. So we do that at NASA now, and we don't use that as an absolute criteria to exclude someone, but we use it to drive us to different decisions on if, for example, if you have a less than a 95% confidence that you're below the standard, that to try to either be more stringent about protective measures or picking a different crew, or ultimately you can have a management decision to have a waiver to that 95% confidence level.
Other questions?
What actions could be included in the definition risk management? What actions? Only establishing the standard, maybe other actions.
Возьмите микрофон, нам дают. Jeff, you want to take that one? Слава, вы уже спите?
Maybe repeat the question.
What actions can be included in the definition risk management? Only establishing the standard, or maybe somewhat additional actions? Can you comment?
Sure, that's a great question. That's something we have under active development at NASA right now. We took the approach that the standard would be a unique standard across all missions. So if there were a standard like radiation that were important to protect health, that would set the level of acceptable risk for that particular exposure or physiological change or whatever. The risk management system enters into when you spread the missions out now, and you take a risk management approach to the risk implied by a particular mission. So it's different if you go to the moon for 2 weeks, or if you go for 6 months, or if you go into deep space and go to Mars. So where we've made the distinction is in setting the requirements and the mitigation strategies against a particular standard based on the mission. So the standard is unique. Where we really take a risk management approach is how to what degree of risk that standard drives a particular mission, and then how do we mitigate it. And the mitigation strategies would be different based on different missions.
Yeah, but the risk management system manages all risks.
There are some procedure distribution, the partial risks connected with various negative factors. Between these factors and some combination of such partial risk for estimation the total risk of mission. There are some procedure or not?
You're absolutely correct. In risk management parlance, it says the summation of a series of moderate risks ultimately sums up to a high risk. And the system attempts to do that. There's no specific algorithm for it, but the risks are tracked against a classification done by the design engineer, specifically according to what is the probability of occurrence of that activity and what is the outcome of the occurrence of that activity. So you can have a high risk for something that has a modest outcome if it's highly probable it will happen, or you can have a high risk for something that's very low probability to occur, but if it happens, has a catastrophic effect. And that is that the risk management system attempts to integrate those kinds of risks together so that the technical design staff then has a sort of an integrated view of what the total risk on any particular mission encompasses. In addition to that, we try to have standards by which risks that fall in a particular category require the program, design engineering, aeromedical, whatever, to take specific actions to drive those risks down. There are risks that are beyond that which policy says won't be accepted.
If I could just add one more comment to that, we have begun to also look at how the risk to the human interfaces with the risk to the mission. And so, again, this likelihood and severity, if you will, of a particular standard has to do with whether it's only a risk to the individual for their being ill or injured, or will it impact the mission or perhaps even the program?
Really, it is the problem of priority of partial risks in current moment of the flight.
Can I add a little bit? We had to take a more simplistic approach because of the type of operation that we're facing with these commercial suborbital flights. We have some of the vehicles that will be high G vehicles, other low G vehicles. We have a couple of designs that they want to use cabin pressure, one that they want to use a pressurized suit, different vehicles, different flying envelopes. That created a challenge for us. It's not the same thing having to wear a pressurized suit as opposed to be in an environment where it's cabin pressure and that's it. So we took a more simplistic approach that is helping so far. Number one, we don't want these people to die as a result of going there. Number one. Number two, we don't want to have a sudden incapacitation in flight that results in the declaration of an in-flight emergency, which compromises the safety of other occupants. So which means puts at risk other people. Number three, one that we want to some extent, make sure that they will be able to use don and doff personal protective equipment. And the final one is that they will be able to get out of the vehicle in case that they have an emergency landing and there has to be an evacuation. So with that approach so far, we'll see where that goes. We already had one accident. It was the Spaceship One final approach. You remember when the landing gear collapsed. So we have already had one experience. What was the crash survivability? No, there were no injuries, not even minor injuries on that occupant. But we are going to learn over time and see how that evolves over time.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. So, Dr. Longenecker?
I wanted to follow up, if I might, on Kathy, your original question and Don McErland's answer regarding submarine service and that as a possible analog. I mean, given the fact that we'll probably never have as much data as we would like from in-flight experiences, that seems to be a particularly attractive alternative to me as well. And in fact, you can supplement it if you look at the Danish and Australian submarine services have both genders, and it would appear to me that the wardrooms, for example, in those kinds of environments would be particularly attractive for looking at team performance and what have you. Is that being done, or should it be done, or is it perhaps a naive approach that is attractive to me only?
Well, I can tell you my view. I don't think it's being done. I can't completely vouch for whether our Russian allies have done it with regards to their submarine service, but I'm pretty certain we haven't done it with regards to the United States Navy. And I agree with you completely. In fact, the maritime model for this could even go back even further than that. I think you mentioned that earlier this morning. Just taking a look at crew dynamics, for example, going back to the 17th century, the rules of the mess in the gunroom were specifically set up so that the crew dynamic did not result in interpersonal conflicts. There were certain subjects that were verboten. You didn't talk about. You didn't talk about religion. You didn't talk about politics, etc. And everyone understood those rules, and they were designed specifically to keep interpersonal emotions from driving the crew apart. You would find the same thing in the submarine service. There's certain cohesiveness that happens and certain rules that govern, and they've been in place in most navies for years. I think the model of the two navies you mentioned that have mixed gender, because the U.S. Navy has resisted females on submarines, would be even more interesting. I think if you think about people living with very little communication to the outside world in a highly dangerous and stressful environment. Now our nuclear submarines go underwater 20 feet out of Puget Sound and don't come up again for months. You would hardly find a better analog, and I would think that the data would be available and should be studied.
But and I'll just add to that before I let some other panel members comment. I mean, within the broader human research program, we are looking hard at analogs, and certain analogs are very useful in certain segments of the research, filling our critical research gaps. So whether it's the Antarctic or Bedrest or Nemo or other types of analogs can do exactly that. And I think we ought to look at the submariner population and see whether there isn't anything we can do in a more systematic way to get a better evidence based on certain critical gaps. And
just one quick comment. We typically break standards into two categories. Medical standards, those things you are trying to protect, you hope don't happen but might. And then physiological standards that are unique to human spaceflight. We have looked at aggregate data from the submarines in the past in terms of medical evacuations. From what system did they derive? We could do more with team performance, but the unique part about spaceflight that still needs to be addressed are all the physiological changes that are created by being exposed to microgravity. So our standards span that full range, and their analogs are good for a certain part, I fully agree, but we also have some unique challenges.
Yeah. And Victor, do you want to have the last word?
Yes. Other than the medical data from the submarines, NASA had asked the National Academy of Sciences through the Committee for Space Biology and Medicine to look at that specific analog. And it was determined at that time that it would not be a good model for behavioral health or other specific areas other than the medical care.
Okay, so I think with that we've run out of time, and I will yield the floor to Jeannie and her panel. Thank you to the panelists.
Doses are much higher. It seems hard to understand why they're
obviously I don't
yeah.
There's only 4 of us, so you can come down here. And we're just still
I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to see you.
Brian O'Connor.
Patrick Sunday.
Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Hi. Brian O'Connor from NASA.
Nancy Kozlowska from Russia.
Nice to meet you.
Yes. You?
From IBMP or?
Yes.
Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Well, as I say, last but not least, and I want to thank the organizers, Dr. Alford and Mr. Abbey, for the opportunity to chair the subpanel, final subpanel of what I think has been a really productive day. This panel is distilled down from its original capacity due to some folks that could not make it. But I want to introduce the folks that are here. Here we have, to my right, Dr. Neil Pellis. Neil is acting as the senior scientist of the Space Life Sciences Director at NASA JSC, and he previously served as the ISS program scientist. He was also the associate director for the Human Research Program Science Management Office, and before that he was faculty at UT and MD Anderson Cancer Center. Next, seated next to him, we have Dr. Patrick Sundblad, and he is the life science coordinator at ESA and the lead for human physiology activities. Seated next to Dr. Sundblad is Colonel Brian O'Connor, who is the Chief of Safety and Mission Assurance for NASA headquarters. And he served in the U.S. Marine Corps and was also an astronaut, a pilot on STS-61B, and commander on STS-40. And finally, we have Dr. Kozlowskaya, who needs no introduction, and we've heard quite a bit from you. You were just introduced. Okay. You were introducted, yes, for sure. Well, we are going to talk today about the human end of risk mitigation strategies dealing with research more specifically. And all the panel members were provided some information and some talking points that they've become familiar with. And so this is going to be a little bit loose, and I'm just going to throw some things out. But in terms of human research, when I think about it, there's certainly a variety of factors to consider. We know that numerous risks are associated with human spaceflight, and we've talked about those risks today. My organization, SBRI, is all about risk mitigation strategies. And central to issues dealing with human research are more specific issues dealing with data acquisition, data handling, data pooling, data analysis, and those sorts of factors. And so what I'd like to throw out to this panel, since we have 3 agencies represented here, essentially is how best are we going to be dealing with data from multiple agencies across international forums? And more specifically, how are we going to interface with each other as agencies to facilitate building knowledge and building the databases that we need to address these risks, dealing with factors that can be compounding, and that is attributable data and small n values. And so I will ask Dr. Kozlowska for her perspective on this. We'll start out with you, if you don't mind.
First of all, I am not the representative of Space Agency. Yes, so maybe it would be better to start with somebody who represents Space Agency. Actually, I was not thinking about this, and I don't know what to tell about this, because it seemed to me, I know the essence of this, because actually it turned out that it is easier sometimes to establish the collaborative studies than later to analyze them together, to establish data sharing and so on, due to different requirements and different rules and so on. And but I think that without this, without solving this question, we will not move forward. because I know that in some of in some of our collaborative studies, or almost collaborative studies, we met this this situation that actually, according to the rules on one side, like on American side, due to to the level of confidentiality, which level of confidentiality is different on Russian and American side. Up to now, we cannot share data, establish the sharing of the data on, even on such simple things like the countermeasure type which this or the other cosmonaut or astronaut was using. And that's to me it seems that it, like, I represent rather scientific community than the managing community, and for me it seems that this is the first thing which should be discussed and agreed upon. Without this, we will not move forward whatsoever. That's my feeling about it.
Yeah, I'm all for sharing data.
You're all for sharing
data?
Yeah.
Yes, we are all for, but how to do it?
When I first got involved with the life science community and preparing for SLS-1, STS-40, I was under the impression that the medical community, the medical research community, had done a lot better job of sharing data with our Russian counterparts than we had on the engineering side. And that was a better model. And yet I know that there are still things like confidentiality rules and so on. But when we're in a project together, and I know there are political and other national agenda barriers that show up, we should always be striving to share data, because getting into space in the first place is so hard to do. It's such high risk to the people that we send up there. That we owe them as much as we can in the way of understanding what the risks are, understanding what we've learned on previous flights. It's really not right not to share data. So.
Yeah, well, I'm also all for sharing data, but where I come from, I mean, ESA is not really working maybe like NASA or ESA, or NASA or IBMP or Russia. We are currently trying to set up a cooperation between ESA Life Science and MedOps and sharing data, which is sort of the first step. And I also want to make clear that human research in ESA, where it's coming from, is that it's user-driven, which basically means that we have presented International Space Station as a laboratory in space, being there for the scientists to do the best science possible. And what it means is that we have not really focused our research community into doing science benefiting primarily crew health or manned spaceflight or so. It has been, we have selected the experiment solely based on science merit. Of course, being human research, usually it's quite relevant for crew health as well. But this is a little bit changing now. We're going more into being supportive of crew health with our human research program. We will probably never be as focused as NASA are right now, but we will have a part of our program being clearly going to support crew health. And this is the area where we will probably try to cooperate also with MedOps, and this is the area where data sharing is most relevant, I think. And the area where we have sort of taken concrete steps is the ground-based research, and I think that when it comes to human research, a lot of things can be done in ground simulations and ground analogs, And here, it's maybe even easier to start sharing data from these kind of studies. And I mean, looking particularly into the bed rest studies, where we are trying, as I know that has been done in the IMAG project, we try to standardize the bed rest in the future. We will have standard measures in order to allow comparability, increase the comparability between the studies. And of course, if we do this in Europe, and it has been done in other countries, data sharing will be easier and will make more sense, and we are all for that. And that would also go for other analogs, like he says, participating in the Mars 500 study or research on the Antarctic Station and so forth.
Thank you. I know there's some good examples of analog studies that are being done, and maybe Dr. Pellis will talk about that with the bed rest group.
Actually, it wasn't on my list, but that's okay. Just looking at the data itself and the challenge with regard to data, we have historic data, we have probably some prospective data, we've got medical data, we've got scientific data. A lot of this is contained in archives in various places, and it's now a challenge within NASA that we are really addressing in a very serious, with very serious strategies on how to begin to avail ourselves of the information that's in that kind of data, and to eventually make that data available to all of us in some way or another, so that we can subject it to the kinds of sophisticated analyses that are out there today. There are many, many ways to approach these large data archives and be able to glean trends and understandings from those. Obviously, a lot of things stand, I don't want to say in the way, but those are things that we have to do before we can do that. The first thing is naturally getting it together and getting it so that it's in a form where we can actually analyze it. Secondly is that attributable data is going to require probably some special treatments that we actually have people who are working on that on a daily basis on how we can actually begin to address at least some of the attributable data or data of specific types that we know that we can actually make agreements with the owners, so to speak, the people who are involved in those studies. And ultimately, you know, within the agency and without the agency, as much of this as we can possibly subject to analyses and make available, we would do that. I think that internationally we've worked together through ISIL-SWIG and through other venues to try to work together on acquiring data. And obviously the joint studies, and some of which are going on the ISS or will go on the ISS very soon, the joint studies with various international partners. And I think that those things obviously are becoming enormously valuable to us. We do have the International Space Station Medical Project, affectionately known as ISSMP. And in fact, I don't know, I saw Dr. Sam's back there somewhere, but there he is, he's got his hand up. And he actually is in charge of all of that and works that very diligently. And we look forward to that actually providing to us new basis, so to speak, data, if you will, to begin to base decisions on. So that, and I think the other thing that will come out ultimately is that there are going to be ways in which we can look to share specimens. Specimen sharing can be an extremely valuable way to do experiments, because for me to just do my own home shop stuff that I love to do and collect these specimens and use maybe 1/100th of it, because of the nature of the analyses today usually require very small amounts of material, there's an enormous wealth of opportunity in there. And so how do we manage a specimen archive and make it available and yet preserve it as an archive and be able to have it for a long enough period of time? So those are the kinds of things that we look at with regard to the data, and whether it's data we already have or the data we anticipate getting. I could go on for a long time with this, but that's just a synopsis of where we are.
Well, thank you.
And what didn't I cover that you said?
No, I had thought about the International Bed Rest Study as one example of a large sharing project.
And I'm going to leave it as an example right now because the data are still forthcoming. There's analyses to be done on that. I think that we're headed in the right direction with that kind of approach.
I know these are really pointed questions, and it's
Jenny, can
yes.
I just add one thing?
Please.
I think that we had a very good model a few years ago. We have tendency to forget, because there was excellent project of Mir-NASA, and we shared data. We made program together. And the program was very sensible. It relates to requests and needs of space flights. We found a way how to agree what is the most important for both sides, and so on and so on. And we shared data. There was no problem of confidentiality, because we worked together on the very same species, let me put it this way. And so we could do it. I don't know why on ISS it doesn't work. I really don't understand it. But I see that it doesn't work, and both of us participate in this not working, properly.
So why on ISS doesn't it work? I'll give that to the audience.
I think one of my thinking that maybe it has to do that with the fact that we don't have joint program, joint organized program, but every country has its own program. Maybe it is time now. Again, come to, at that time it was on Mir station, on Russian Mir station. Now it is on international station. Maybe it is time now to try to organize the joint program, to discuss it, to make the common discussion, to make the experiment real collaborative. Maybe we will overcome the difficulty.
Well, I think some of the activities that are planned on ISS as a national laboratory will hopefully bridge some of those gaps. And I don't know if other folks might want to contribute to the conversation.
Just a partial step. If I think it will be difficult to maybe do one large ISS program, but there is clearly a different pool of experiments in the different agencies. And looking at these pools, we started to do this a little bit in the framework of ESOSWIG. It's clear that there are different activities in different agencies that are overlapping to a very large extent. And there you can really make an effort to see to what extent you can cooperate, and that could be a matter of sharing samples, urine
I agree
or
completely,
blood.
because I think that when I talk about program, I don't mean something great, but it can concern concrete experiments, concrete areas, and concrete even scientists who can collaborate and who are overlapping, as you said.
As we discussed before, I mean, it's usually easier to cooperate if you start on a project level, on a scientific level, where there is a common interest.
I think that what Ines is pointing to here, and I'm not sure exactly, if I got this correct, but one of the things you have to think about is that this is a laboratory still in construction. And there are international partner segments yet to be there. And I think before we make a judgment as to how, we're interacting on it, we ought to have as much of the capability there as possible before we do that. And I think that it will come because when we went to Mir and we did the Mir program, that was a mature facility. I know that they added Spectre while we were in the beginning phases of that, but it was a fairly mature facility for us to be working in, and we're still in the building stage here. So I may be wrong in saying that, and I welcome my management to come and correct me, because I've been wrong a lot of times.
I know that like in my area in sensory motor, we started the cooperation program on Mir-NASA. And we still cooperate from that time on, because we are very close in our thinking and our interest and so on and so on. And actually, we are overlapping in studying posture disturbances and locomotion and sensory motor and vestibular motor, oculomotor, and so on. And something when it comes to making the collaborative program, that it stops. And I think that that's exactly what Dr. Sandblad said, that on scientific level, there are no obstacles. On scientific level, we are doing it very well. So it seems to me, I'm sorry to say it, but it seems to me that management, which actually their goal is to help this collaboration to grow. Instead of this, they somehow suppress our tendency to get together. Sorry for...
No, we appreciate this. It's a controversial subject, and that's why I threw it out here at the end of the day when everybody's thinking about dinner, because I wanted to get your attention. And it is not something that's going to be easily solved. We heard from Jean Clark earlier today that more than half of the spaceflight data and experience relies on the Russian side, and so these issues of data sharing and understanding how we can go forward to address human risk in a program that hopefully will be international in scope are extremely important issues, and we're not going to solve them here, but I think it's good to start bringing up these points and certainly thinking about
it. Right.
Yes,
that's true.
I can open it up to yes.
Ken. He was surprised the first time. During our session now.
I'm just trying to figure out what Ken Baldwin is.
This is basically my perception of the world, but I think it's important to have scientists in all the agencies that support the initiatives in space. And the reason is scientists exist to have their research peer-reviewed. And the most important thing about peer review is that you get the scientific community to basically evaluate the pluses and minuses on it. And what I have seen is that there is a lot of data out there that has been peer-reviewed that gives us a very good level of insight in various disciplines. In other disciplines, for some reason, the data hasn't come forward. Now, when you deal with ISS, if you're going to try to publish a study, it takes several campaigns in order to get your 6 to 7 subjects in order to analyze your data and put it out there. As opposed to a bed rest campaign, for example, the ones that ESA has put together, where there are enough subjects per campaign that it seems as though it doesn't take as long in order to get that data out there and to get it peer-reviewed. So I really feel that the more energy that we put into trying to get peer-reviewed information out there, the better we stand in terms of getting profiles for where we are in terms of achieving the mission. There's one other comment I wanted to make. Last week I was in Washington, D.C., and I saw an IMAX film, Walking on the Moon. And it was an eye-opener for me. It was an eye-opener not just because it gave us a history of what went on, but a scenario was carried out in that film. And the scenario was 2 astronauts were out in the moon rover, and they hit a bump, and the wheel came off, or something to that effect. They were down, about half of their oxygen was left, and they had to get back to the mother lode facility, and they knew that they had to get there fast. And so in that scenario, they had to haul it, as I would say, in order to get there, and it challenged their physiological system. And when we talk about risks, to me, risks, plural, must be set for the most challenging physiological state likely to be encountered in a given mission architecture, whether it's the moon or Mars, and that should be the standard for us to look at risk factors and countermeasures. End of commercial.
Ken, in just a little response to that, we do have programs where, and Mike's not here, I don't think. Is Mike Gernhardt gone? Because he could describe this and show you what we've actually done, and done just that for EVA and for a 10-kilometer return, and metabolically what it would take. We have simulators where we've put it together, and he actually using moon-style locomotion, what it would take.
Beautiful. I give you guys A+ on that. But I'll mark you down to a B+ because the data hasn't been published so that we can see it.
Yeah, but this is very, very recent. I saw the first report on it probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago. Okay, and so I mean, it's not like that this is something we've been doing for the past 25 years. But you bring up a very important point, and that's in a very critical issue as far as risk is concerned, and something we actually have addressed.
Jeannie, when we were all together in February, I know we were discussing the Life Science Data Archive, and I think the point was made that it's a wonderful archive. Most of the data that's in there right now is from the research community, from, say, Space Lab or ISS experiments, where you're dealing with fairly small N. Right. And I think it was Kathy mentioned that there may be a possibility of trying to also get access to the data from the medical side. But obviously there are a whole bunch of issues related to privacy, confidentiality, and so forth. Is any progress being made on that, and what are the possibilities? But the notion of being able to get an N of 300.
I wish Kathleen was
300. Actually, John Charles is back there. He heads up the Science Management Office, and part of the office is actually diligently working on just that. We have people who are dedicated to working with getting the kinds of agreements to get the attributable data. It probably will not be all of it, but like I said, there are certain kinds that I think we can negotiate and get.
I'd just like to make one comment too. It's not the entire data set, but back several months ago, we reduced the first 12 increments of the MRID data, if you will. And we have gotten that through the approval cycle to the point of it's now in the approval that it could be published and released. That would be at least the first 12 increments. And that's not all data for all time, but it does show you what we've seen in the first 12 increments and some of the follow-on. The whole issue of the data management, as Neil pointed out, is probably our top priority within our risk management system. And it's a multi-side challenge. It's not only getting the medical data sets and the research data sets, but also getting, hopefully, to the point where you can deal with attributable individual data that because folks are interested in unique measurements, not just group data. Mm-hmm. So this is a multi-part problem, and we're trying to work down it. It's obviously easier to start with group data, published data, and we'll work down to the harder issues, which is this individual attributable data.
Dr. Poole.
Another piece of this puzzle is the longitudinal study of astronaut health. Mm-hmm. And for a number of years, we have courted our Russian colleagues to participate in that effort. I believe that all the multilateral partners should participate in the longitudinal study of astronaut health. This could be a very powerful tool we could use to guide the sort of medical interventions we plan for because it involves both flight and ground data.
Other comments from the panel?
Just one other thing and follow up on Dr. Poole's statement there with regard to longitudinal health. In addition, with what Gerst had talked about, Bill Gerstenmaier mentioned about us having an archive that's being formed actually on Space Station where we're collecting specimens. This is an opportunity to see serial data in individuals. And those of you who've been involved with small N clinical studies know the value of that kind of data.
But are you talking about clinical studies, not
the scientific experimental studies.
This
no?
is not a science.
Yeah,
this is not a
but,
scientific study. This is something you can apply to do a
No, I know,
scientific
but
study
like
against.
on our side, Dr. Varankov is here and Dr. Bogomolov because we are doing longitudinal studies with cosmonauts for years. That's for sure. And Dr. Pachuev is here. You know, all of them are involved in this.
Yeah, but as far as our experience has been a lot of pre and post type specimens, but now it's in flight as well. So you have pre, in flight, and post that you can follow longitudinally on individuals through the course of their flight experience. And that, to me, is an extremely valuable way to approach it when you've got small n. And it gives us the prospect that through 2010 or 12, we might be able to accumulate enough to actually make some sense out of some
I don't
things.
understand. Are you talking about the monitoring data and whatever data in flight, or it is scientific data that obtained during experimental?
Monitoring data for medical purposes is in the what we call the MRID, and that's proscribed data, and that data is all confidential at the point, at some point.
All right.
And I don't know when if that
so
gets released.
So you talk about scientific data obtained in and post flight.
Well, it's not data right now; it's specimens. That's the point. I'm trying to keep you from saying data. It's specimens right now. And it's something that didn't exist before, and I think it could be quite valuable. We would love to see.
I think that's
like to see
my problem with English, because I don't understand what does it mean. It is not data, but it is specimen. What can you explain to me in simple words? What is the difference?
Saliva, blood, and urine specimens are being serially frozen while we're on orbit. There will be pre and post samples. It's all part of that archive program. Okay, so that on individuals, you will have an entire series that takes them through the entire adaptation phase and readaptation phase. Rather than trying to take pre and post specimens and hopefully accumulating 40 of them or 25 of them or something so you can get a statistically valid model. Okay, that's very difficult, and the prospect for that is less likely than getting the serial specimens that we're talking about. The serial specimens we might only get 6 or 7 or 8, but it won't matter because they're serial, and they'll be able to tell us on an individual basis a lot of what's happening. And those specimens, we haven't even gone into what kinds of analyses they'll be subjected to: proteomic, genomic. A number of things can be done. We'll be looking for specific organic and inorganic analytes. I mean, you can name anything you want practically. But without that repository, the possibility is not there at all. With that repository, we can make decisions ultimately and actually, at least for some areas, be able to make some headway.
Dr. Bogomolov?
I would like to ensure that we talk with a common understanding, we use the common language. In fact, exchanging the data as part of medical operations for a number of directions has been very well developed, and we are doing that quite actively with respect to air quality, with respect to radiation environment, microbiological environment and situation. And so data collection and exchange is quite satisfactory there, I would say too. And when we are talking about samples such as blood, saliva, specimen, I think will be consider them meaningful once we know the conditions under which they were collected. This refers both to activities of the crew members, the conditions on board the station, including temperature conditions and sleep shifting, etc., and their functional status, Dr. Kozlovska added, and that is a very important problem so that based on that information we could make some kind of scientific conclusions. That's one aspect of the issue. And the other aspect is also very important, and it's related to performing scientific studies. Each of the participants are doing those, and those studies are also frequently duplicated. For example, they're processed differently. Sometimes they're difficult to compare. For example, in order to set up our cooperation, full-fledged cooperation, we need not just the desire from the scientists, they are full of that desire. However, we need to get permissions from the program managers, because when we face some issue with respect to exchanging data, the managers of agencies would tell us that we're interfering with the balance of contributions, the balance of interests, and that this impedes the work and slows it down. So I think that in order to build our projects in the future, such major projects as the Martian expedition, etc., we need to bring forth to the attention of management and heads of agencies that we're interested in the aspects of medical policy, that we're interested in those data exchanges. And then with respect to the private medical data, we have a multilateral group which includes all the international partners, and we have been working on developing a system of how you handle that private data. So we're working on the system that would enable us, without violating the privacy and confidentiality principles, to conduct the data exchange. And I think that that's quite a highly promising area. However, at this time, it doesn't exist yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. And yes.
Just a quick comment on Dr. Kozlovska's statement about the NASA mirror. Maybe using a NASA mirror example is a little bit misleading. If you remember, and Mr. Abbey remembers very well, it was mid-90s, Russia was just entering market society, and that was a commercial project. NASA mirror was a commercial project for Russia. An ISS program is a partnership. And that's what Dr. Bogomolov was talking about. Right. So that's why all the difficulties to have a joint research program.
No, I cannot agree completely, because I don't know. I think, Igor, that you represent now the management point of view, because the Mir NASA project maybe was commercial, and I don't know it because I'm not a manager. Maybe on the management part it was commercial, but on scientific part it was not commercial whatsoever. It was excellent model of collaboration, and I think that if at least we will reproduce this model, it will be okay already.
But it was based on a contractual, agreement with the Russian Space Agency and NASA.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So that's maybe. So again, you say now what Dr. Bogomolov just now said, that on the scientific level, there are no obstacles to work together. There is an interest to work together. There is understanding that joining our power together will help and will give the opportunity and so on and so on. So now we come to the level of the management. Then we don't have to sit here. Just put here the manager and let them discuss how to to do, not to be in the way of scientists. Let me put it this way.
Thank you for those thoughtful comments. We're going to wrap up with one final question up here.
I just wanted to comment. I think Dr. Kozlowska is completely right. Following the model of MIR, when it came time for us to do our psychological study on the ISS, we were allowed to contract as a PI with the IBMP to keep our relationship going because we needed to study cross-culturally Russian and American subjects. And I was able to do that with a line item and an ability to contract as a non-NASA person in the contract from NASA, and it worked beautifully. We got data, we have papers we've written together that we continued the same work that we did in MIR into the ISS, have another data set that includes it. We had to do a few things. We had to agree with our subjects to do unusual confidentiality issues where, I won't get into it, we have a paper on that, but where we had to, where the subjects got their own ID codes, we didn't know their codes because we were interested in group level data. But the result is we've got data from Americans and Russians in 2 studies, MIR and ISS. We have collaboration with colleagues in Russia that have been wonderful for 15 years. And at the level of the PI, we've kind of done science. And I think it's very important for management to provide the flexibility for the PIs to do this kind of work, to allow us to work with colleagues in other cultures, if that's what the study's about, and to be able to subcontract and to work with them in that way. I was told NASA doesn't have a contract with the Russian Space Agency, which is true for ISS, but we were able at the local level to work this thing out. And it's been, I think, a wonderful experience. I mean, Dr. Gushin is one of our collaborators. So I think there are ways around it. I think there are ways that management needs to see that sometimes the PIs can work things out scientifically together for the mutual good of both agencies. We have no problem in publishing because we have co-investigators on both sides. In fact, we have a paper coming out next month in Aviation, Space, Environmental Medicine. That's our ISS studies with Russian and American co-investigators. This is the way science needs to be done, and I think it's possible. It's just a matter of being a little bit creative and allowing the PIs to be more flexible in how they interact with each other.
That's exactly.
I think the bottom line, data sharing is good. We just need to figure out how to be creative and do this. And Dr. Kavanaugh, if you can say it in 10 seconds or less, you can wrap us up.
I'll just give a contrasting perspective to Dr. Canis's view, where as a PI on an ISS experiment, I gave an informed consent briefing to both American and Russian crew members, but the Russian crew members were not able to participate because no financial arrangements were in place. So we're all saying the same thing, I think, but there we have 2 contrasting situations.
Well, I want to thank everybody for all these wonderful comments, and we can continue them over dinner. And thank you all for your attention.